Welcome back, everyone. Jonathan, we've already heard from the submitters ahead of you, so if you're there and available, we'll ask you to present. Call you out, you were sort of thought you had 10 minutes to spare, I think.
Warm up. All good, all good.
Yeah.
So listen, just checking you can hear me okay?
Yes, we're all good.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, will I proceed now?
Yes, please, yes.
Lovely. Okay. Okay, well, thank you once again for the opportunity to present to you about the controls for relocated buildings in the New Plymouth area, this time looking at the residential zones. I think the commissioners and the council will be familiar with the association's approach. And so broadly, we support what's noted in the Section 42A report for permitted activity with no bond. However, as written, as documented in our written statement, so there are a couple of points that I'd like to talk to you about. One of them, just covering off point 4.5. So as we've pointed out, so in the medium residential zone recommended changes, the status is still noted as controlled and with a bond, but we assume that this is probably an error given that the Section 42A report states otherwise. So it should be, the opportunity should be for permitted and with no bond. So, so that's the first point just to reinforce. So that's our point number 4.5. Don't know if there's any particular questions about that one.
Jonathan, I'll just check with Campbell.
Certainly the intention that the provisions be the same across the three. So
yes, so can you hear Campbell? Campbell's our reporting officer, Jonathan. So
I think.
Repeat that.
sorry, just to confirm that it's the intention that the provisions for relocated buildings would be applied consistently across the three chapters. So if there is a drafting error there, then we'll certainly follow that up.
Lovely. Thank you. Okay, we would be happy with that. So, and then perhaps the more substantive point that we'd like to make is captured in 4.1 in our written statement. And so this is about the proposed changes in the Section 42A report, and that the requirement that the building is on foundation within 12 months. So the report states that this is based on the rural production, the rural lifestyle zone performance conditions. However, in our analysis of the documents, this clause actually wasn't mentioned in the recommended amendments, only the recommended decisions. When I go back and look at our association submissions on this point, so the first feedback that we provided was to the draft plan for New Plymouth, and this is where we first stated about a 2-month timeline. But then in our written submission to the proposed plan, this for some reason was perhaps stated in error at 12 months. So that's, in that case, it's our error. But despite all this, so in previous hearings, this particular clause, despite the fact that we'd mentioned it in our submissions, wasn't actually taken up as a likely performance requirement for permitted activity status. However, in other council areas around the country, we have been promoting this 2-month period to be on foundations. And basically this is because we don't like to see buildings sitting unnecessarily on temporary supports. We like to see them placed on permanent foundations as required in a building consent. So that's why in other council areas we had supported this, And in our previous, in our written and or in our written submissions, we had stated that this should be considered by the council. So I guess as a result, we'd still be pleased to accept this 2-month period. And I guess particularly in the residential zones. So in other zones where I guess the impact of perhaps a building sitting on temporary supports, there may not be quite the amenity issues, but in the residential zones for a building to be sat on the sties or other temporary supports, jacks, for a period of time exceeding 2 months, could affect the amenity of the area, and not something that we'd like to see as an industry body representing the relocation sector. But we don't necessarily see that beyond the residential zones that this would be a requirement, but we'd be happy to consider that otherwise. So I guess that sums up my what I want to say about this particular point. And I have one final point about consistency. Will I, across the zones, will I pause while we talk about this, or will I go on to
let's just pause on the 12 months versus 2 month aspect. It's actually unusual for someone to be looking for more restrictive position, but your point well made. And certainly if it's made an error and there's logic to it, and we could probably look at that under minor amendment or something with this evidence, if you could support that.
Certainly. I think if the submission is or the evidence is suggesting that would lead to improved sort of amenity outcomes, then I think, yeah, certainly be favourable to that or open to that. It doesn't appear to be well, I guess I'm wondering, is there a particular downside through the chair?
No, I can't see. I mean, I'm familiar with a certain house that's stuck up on jacks near Clive and Hawke's Bay that I travel past regularly between Napier and Hastings. It's been there for a couple of years now. I just walked on a rural residential section, just sitting up on jacks. So I definitely see the point Jonathan's making. So if the evidence, my suggestion is you do have a look at that handle and see whether you're happy to make a change based on the evidence. Yeah. Kit, did you have anything else? No. So move to the last point now, Jonathan.
So I guess picking up on that, so I guess it's around consistency, and I guess it's consistency across the zones. And so what we've seen is that there are different council planners and different people undertaking the 42A reports, and across all the different, I guess the commercial and the rural and now the residential zones that we've submitted to. And to us, there will be some usefulness in the wording of the clauses across the different zones being as consistent as possible, as long as that is obviously the requirement. And I guess that, you know, what we've, I guess the latter example of this clause just appearing suddenly, you know, it was stated that it was in the rural production zone, proposed changes, but it actually wasn't. And I guess it's just making sure that we have consistency across the zones where it's warranted. I think we could be close to that, but I guess, as I say, it's just making sure that the wording of the performance requirements in particular is consistent where it needs to be consistent across the zone. So I guess that's the final point that we'd like to make.
Thank you, Jonathan. That is a point well made. We've had some correspondence from the district plan lead, Ms. Edwards, about that being a topic for the sweep up hearing, which is programmed for August, where the planners will go back and look at consistency across chapters where there are the similar provisions working its way through the different chapters. So it seems to me that the council team are alive to exactly what you're saying, And hopefully we'll see a check, or I'm sure Cam will make a note to do a check on this one, just across the other reporting officers who are looking at their chapters in relation to building relocation.
Okay, and can I just, I guess, reiterate the point just around that on foundations and 2-month performance criteria, that's something that certainly we would promote for the residential zones, but not necessarily something that I think needs to be in place for perhaps the rural or the commercial ones. I think that, you know, the amenity issue is not so much of a problem there, and there may be other issues or other reasons why. Well, I mean, that clause hasn't been mentioned in those zones, so I guess what I'm saying is that perhaps we should leave it out of that one and just keep it in this these residential zones.
Okay. Yes. Got a note of that, Campbell. Yes. Did you have any questions? No, I think we're all happy and good. Jonathan, thank you for your attendance again, and we may see you at the sweep up. We may not. You won't be involved in the rezoning hearings, I presume. You're more concerned with the district-wide chapters?
Yes, correct. Yeah. So yes, I guess unless we see a need to be involved in the swept up one, then this could be our last appearance. So on that note, thank you very much for the attendance of the commissioners to the points that we've raised, and I think that from our perspective, the outcome with where the controls on relocated buildings are heading in the New Plymouth Council area, certainly we're quite happy with them. We're delighted with where things have ended up. So it's really great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's pretty full on that. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, great to see that. So today we've got Rangi with us as well. So Rangi's only speaking to you online, which is great. So to start off our submission, so Rangi's going to start. We've just received a copy of this, which thank you so much for printing that. Because we've done everything online, I forgot to print. And then because Maria is covering off the design guide, so she'll follow on after that. And hopefully there won't be too much for me to do. It's all been done. So yeah. Anyway,
Thank you.
thank you. Nice to see you.
You're welcome. It is great to see everyone face to face again. And, certainly appreciated your advice to us in the previous hearing, so we're in your hands.
Okay, I'm going to admit that I'm not a specialist in drafting design plans, but my role in Tihei, a company that I own, where I'm the creative director, I'm pretty much on a day-to-day basis in the trenches with architects and planners and other people trying to give effect to them. So that's where my area of expertise lies. So I'm just going to skip the introduction. I've done that before. Rangi Kipa, my name is Rangi Kipa. I'm the creative director at Tihei, a Māori co-design specialist. We're on a lot of jobs at present. The hospital job here, St. Mary's, Sergeant Gallery at Manganui, archives, the new archives built in Wellington, the redesign of National Library, immediately adjacent to archives, and Te Matapihi, which is Wellington City Library as well. So, and that are probably our big jobs, and then we've got a whole bunch of others that are on. So co-design, it's become a thing really in the last, let's say, 5 years. It's really started to pick up pace, and I think most of the Crown agencies that we're dealing with, all councils are doing that because they're realising it's an effective way to give effect to their treaty obligations. But I better stick to the plan here. So our purpose and scope of this evidence is to address the expectations of Tangata Whenua with respect to the built environment in the district. B, a design process can achieve these outcomes, and see the role of the design guide in achieving those outcomes. So context point number 4, this evidence builds upon the conversation I previously had with the hearing panel through hearings 19 and 21. During those conversations, we explored some of those events in our shared history and how those continue to impact on our people today. We discussed the rich, deep, and diverse and broad realities which make up our communities here, and also the obligation of our wider community that benefited from the expropriation of the ancestral lands and resources, and they work to reconcile our conflict history to restore and embed the rich Indigenous system of design that communicate our lived expression, so that we don't feel like we're ghosts in our own land, and so that our children, they deserve to see themselves reflected in every part of this land. A good place to start, we think, is to embed our presence back into the built infrastructure that they live in. I've previously provided examples of projects where a co-design process has made massive leaps in achieving these radically different outcomes. Te Hono is probably the best example in this district so far. It's important to reiterate ourselves that we had to kind of force their way into the design process for Te Hono. That it was only after a period of several years that co-design really started to be developed and utilised. As we became involved with the project, our critique and pressure forced the 2-day wānanga to consider the project brief and goals, or reconsider the project brief and goals. When the respective stakeholders each gave a presentation on the vision of the project, the commission lead architect spoke to his design, and then beamed with pride as he described that he put aside an area of about 2 meters by 2 meters. At one of the entrances, we had reserved an area proposed where we could put a pou there, or maybe a stone. I know the hearing panel have visited Te Hono and understand the social and cultural backdrop to that very large and special piece of whenua. It all seems a little beguiling and amusing now in hindsight, but this example highlights that you just don't know what you just don't know. So there's a whole millennia of prehistory to that piece of land, or to this region, to this whenua, to this motu, and every other site, that if mana whenua are disenfranchised from an active participation in the design process that gives life to ancestral, present, and future Māori realities, then the colonial narratives and methodologies will prevail. Point number 6, the co-design process is much more than working on what a building might look like. It reflects a design process which aims to achieve design excellence, which is specific to Aotearoa. And in this case, we should be talking about Taranaki, and if we drill down even further to Te Atiawa, and you can go deeper and deeper and deeper as you go on. It considers appropriate engagement and wānanga with mana whenua, and sets the tone to formulate a brief that is fit for purpose for all stakeholders. We know that the physical environment that we live in shapes our thinking and influences our behaviour. These are a reflection of our social and cultural history and give context to our lives. As Aotearoa struggles to reconcile itself with a tangata whenua perspective on our history and our lived reality, these design guides offer a methodology to redesign our future. That process ultimately challenges entities and institutions and how they go about their business, and also how that might be reflected in the architecture that we live in. Point number 7, for mana whenua, the principle of context is critical in design. The orientation of buildings relies heavily upon the nature of context and how they speak to us as a living, breathing extension of our interpersonal relationships. in a manner that is context specific from a mana whenua perspective. In Te Ao Māori, buildings and civic structures engage principles that are deeply wedded to our Māori and Pacific origins. Those design principles illuminate the inner workings and values, ethics, norms, codes of conduct, symbols, all of the stuff that we call cultural practice or context. The challenge of how people might use this space and how that reconstructs some of the ideals and norms which make up our lived reality in those places are fundamental to increasing the visibility of Māori and our communities in the landscape. In a land that has tirelessly dedicated itself to expunging any trace of Native people through the imposition of expressly British symbols of architecture and these underlying notions of a civilizing mission were commonly referred to in the literature of the time. We know that restoring Māori visibility is an act of validation for Māori. Many of us will not understand the implications unless you have traveled to other countries where no one speaks your language, and where every part of that society excludes you, and where you recognize that you do not enjoy the privileges of having equitable access to power and authority. The role of design, of a design guide. Point number 10, I understand te kotahitanga o Te Atiawa submitted to amend all 3 design guides alongside Tangata Whenua to better incorporate Māori values and expertise. I understand no process has been initiated to resolve those submissions, even though the co-design process was utilised to develop the centre city strategy. The continual reference to the capacity of iwi being the limiting factor as to why this process did not occur is disingenuous and misleading in my opinion. Notwithstanding this, there are a number of design guides already available, and there are many in the process of being completed as co-design becomes increasingly utilised. The council could have reviewed these to better understand the submissions. I consider that the Te Mata Popore produced urban design guide of Ngāi Tuahuriri Ngāi Tahu is an excellent example. Te Atiawa Taranaki Whānui ki te Whanganui Ātara has recently produced their first draft of their design guide for the Wellington Valley area, and we as THEI regularly produce design guides or responses for our project engagements. Design guides are critical to the success of placing a design methodology on a pathway to design excellence. As stated previously, it reinforces the establishment of a context-specific response from the mana whenua bias. I understand that the design guides attached to the proposed district plans are a statutory document, therefore will have a direct bearing on the resource consent process for buildings in the residential zones, city and town centre zones, and subdivisions across the district. As they're currently drafted, this is problematic. With the exception of several very generic statements, the design guides are silent on the outcomes I've discussed above. There are no clear and explicit statements about the role of design and how this will achieve a built environment that is actively influenced by Māori realities. These considerations would and could radically change our sense of place in our own lands, and there would be a more autochthonous expression of who we are. This would influence and more readily socialise Māori cartographic, spatial, architectural, topographic traditions, privilege endemic and endangered flora and fauna species, and promote and restore our 2D and 3D visual language systems and traditions. In my view, much of what we see around us with respect to the built environment is a result of a deficit / reduce risk as much as possible mentality that sees developers designed to the rules to avoid the need for a resource consent as far as possible, rather than taking a context / design excellence-led approach to determine what works best at a site and how the project can engage head-on to realise the reconstruction restorative outcomes that I've discussed above. And in my presentations to hearings 19 and 21. The design guides perpetuate this approach. The design guides are also helpful in that it clearly explains the reason why they are relevant to other parties, and clearly outlines the process so that the respective parties are clear about who the parties are and how they can engage to get excellent design outcomes so that no one can continue to plead ignorance. Having a clearer process means that it enables our people to respond as well and be prepared to apportion time and people to respond to this need in the sector. In my opinion, the design guides need to be urgently redesigned pursuant to a co-design methodology. This creates a Te Ao Māori contextual response and gives effect to the restoration of relationship of tangata whenua in this landscape. So my recommendations are, point 17, to address the matters that I've raised in this evidence. I recommend the following. A, to agree to develop a co-design methodology alongside Māori design experts to redesign the proposed district plan design guides. And B, the proposed district plan design guides are co-designed with Mana Whenua.
Thank you, Randy. Do you have any questions?
I just wanted to say again, I very much appreciate your presence and your advice. They're very important, both personally and for this process. So I very much wanted to acknowledge that. Excellent. I guess a couple of questions, and I'm not sure whether Maria has reported back on some of the conversation we were having this morning around, take it as a no, about the design guidelines. When I was refreshing myself for the hearing, because of course we were Stephen got sick unfortunately last time, and so we sort of everyone put their pens down and put it to one side, and I was just getting back into it over the last few days. And one of the things that occurred to me around this issue is whether there is any appetite for Taranaki iwi to prepare their own urban design guide for the benefit of all people who might develop in here, rather than, I mean, it's not a co-design process. I don't know, what do you think of that? I mean, do you think it's better that it's done in concert with the council, because that's the key sort of route to the people, to Pakeha who might be developing land? Or do you think there's an opportunity outside of what the council might do to create your own gold standard to some extent, te aranga, but put through the Taranaki lens to some extent, and encourage that for use?
The obvious answer is yes. And I'm not a designer, or, sorry, I'm not a planner, or and sometimes I struggle to follow your guys' conversations around, you know,
Stuff.
yeah, around stuff. We're struggling with capacity and resourcing.
Okay.
And as the sector's growing, we're responding to growing, you know, our own ability to respond. I suppose I'd like to invite the opportunity for Maria and Sarah to respond as well. But definitely, and actually in my conversations with Te Atiawa Taranaki whānui in Wellington, I've suggested to them that we should actually try and marry our, you know, at least their design guide that they're developing now with ours up here, because we have so much. Well, of course, our whakapapa and the whakapapa of our lived reality is related. You know, it makes actually good sense to some extent to piggyback on each other, because even though there'll be peculiarities with our lived reality and how our people might want to express themselves here versus, let's say, in Whanganui-a-Tara, there'll probably be far more in concert than what they would be competing with each other.
I found it quite interesting that, thanks for that, in the now formally lodged iwi environmental management plan, there's some very clear objectives and policies around design for urban spaces, very much echoing some of your sentiments today. I mean, for example, a lack of participation in urban and township planning and development has resulted in adverse effects on Te Atiawa values. Objective, acknowledge and provide for the values and expressions of our narrative in the built form and landscaping for urban environments. I mean, these are already there, and to some extent, well, not to some extent, we're obliged from a statutory perspective to have regard to these, the contents of these iwi management plans. So there is a really good, there's a really good foundation for this. and we'll get to Sarah and Maria in due course. Okay. There's, I guess there's just a couple of other things I wanted to talk to you a little bit about. There's two things here going on. One is how you design a design guide that best marries and gives voice and expression to Te Ao Māori concepts within as a guideline. So you create the guideline. And I think what we've heard is that the process by which these guidelines have been created and incorporated with the plan has not been ideal in terms of engagement with tangata whenua. So instantly, we've got this machinery attached to the plan, which arguably doesn't get the whole way. The second issue really is assuming that those guidelines were created in that way and were co-designed to some extent. How do you see them then being, I guess, put into practice on a daily basis? And that involves, in my mind, a couple of questions. Do they apply to everything? Or is there a threshold of activity or building or environment where where it's preferred that they have their domain? And I guess one of the things that's been talked about is that, and one of the recommendations from Campbell is that to try and appease a concern that there's a lot of detail in the guidelines, there's been a threshold set within the plan at which you need to take them into account. So, for example, it would only be on residential development over a certain number of units, for example, or in the town centre, it would be for any sort of building that had an interface with the streetscape and those sorts of things. So that is a big ramble of everything that's going in my head at the moment, and I apologise for that. But I'm just really interested in your thoughts on those two journeys. One, how you best create the guideline, and then the second one, once you've created it, what is its domain in terms of natural resource and activities?
Okay, I mean, those are really interesting philosophical debates, I think. I think the first thing is that I'd like you to recognise that any response that you might get now might be quite radically different in 5 years' time. I think, you know, if you've got anything out of my evidence that I've given over the hearings that I've been involved with, I think one thing that I've tried to impress is that even when we look, so you guys outside of our communities look into our world and see Te Ao Māori as whatever it is, and even ourselves as we gaze back into our own world, see it as whatever it is, and imagine in our minds that it's the fullness of what it should have been. It's not. It's a faint shadow. We've been dismantled. I've reminded us of that, and that as we slowly put ourselves back together again, our expectations of and even our own cognizance. I mean, even we're in the process of relearning ourselves again, restructuring our world again. So, you know, if you understand the colonial paradigm and the experiment, it systematically broke down our world right into even our intellectual and philosophical understandings and relationship of who we are with our environment. So we're in the process of rebuilding our world again. So as we slowly stitch our world back together, our understanding of our place and our understanding of our kaiao and our place in it is a growing thing. So let's just acknowledge that that's, you know, what we are today is not what we were, and it's not going to be in 5, 10, 15 years time. So a design guide today, in my mind, or at any stage, is a living document. And that we think that we, or at least in Tihei, we've been really aggressive in, for instance, looking at our this is a good example of our environmental policies. And so one of the things that we have a really aggressive policy about making sure that we privilege, for instance, we privilege endemic endangered species. And so we have a view about even what plants people should be planting, because we have a responsibility to look after the plants that are endemic to these lands. Before we even look at the privilege of, let's say, what we as humans might want. So, so this is quite a large philosophical discussion, and I'm probably at the more aggressive end of it. So, because I think that's, you know, it's, I won't mince words about it. We're in an instinct, you know, extinction, the sixth extinction period. And if we're not more realistic about our reality, then unfortunately we may not survive it. And unfortunately, you fellas are going to take us down with this. So we're really aggressive about what we think our responsibility is around our flora, fauna, and the impact that our activities have on this land. I don't know if that makes any sense to you. It makes sense to people? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. Yeah. One thing that's come through loud and clear is your notion that anything that's created is a living document, and it will evolve as we heal or restore or do things, which sort of speaks to one of the factors we've got to consider as to whether this document has to go through a statutory process every time you want to do another version of it, or whether it's best to allow it to be managed by the stakeholders who are those that are responsible for it outside the plan.
And I suppose that's why I'm careful about the words that I use when I talk about stuff like this, and that's why I use the term lived reality. So our you know, like 30 years ago, we didn't have, you know, 35 years ago, we didn't have moko, we didn't have mauraka, we didn't have waka, there's a whole body of knowledge systems that we are systematically reviving as we seek to be, as we seek to fully realize our lived existence, as we seek to flourish and be Māori in our own lands. And that process will continue as we seek to dismantle the colonial influence on our lives. And you know, the plan is not to get back to 1380 or something, because there's the realities, right, and moving ahead. But we want to be in control of what that looks like for us. And that's a right that's guaranteed to us under the treaty. And so that's why I use the term lived realities, because as we live ourselves into the future, they'll be whatever they have to be. They won't necessarily be snapshots of back in 1200 or 1840. So as we seek to realize our best lives, that's where our design guides will seek to give life to those things. So it's for me, I'm actually not in the detail of the design guides. I'm in the detail of what the design guides are trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that is.
Yeah, I'll leave you guys up to figure out the numbers.
That is equally important. I mean, that's incredibly important, because if you don't know what you're designing to achieve, no guidelines going to help you.
No.
You got to create it with that vision in mind. And look, I must say, I really, you know, don't know what the right adjectives are really, but it occurred to me yesterday when we were driving through Waitara out to Manukarihi and looking at some of the parcels of land out there and some of the blocks that you've talked to us about. It's the first time I've actually had a chance to go out there and looking at the difference between the old parts of Waitara and some of the newer ones. And it was like, it was just a different country. And it really, it made me realize the reality of what you've said in your evidence and what Sarah and Maria said, that how do you live in your own country when everything you see around you is not yours? And that was, and yes, saw the practical implication of that.
I think you should go further than that. You should recognise that actually they were systematically dismantled. So like if you look at the railway line as it enters into Waitara, goes straight through Pukekōhatu-Pā, cuts through Pukekōhatu-Pā. You know, the main road cuts it right through Mahuetahi, Pukeariki, you know, bulldozed off the face of the earth. So our cathedrals of political and institutional power have been removed. We don't have anything. And it's difficult to explain to people.
I had another really personal example about this. I went to university in Christchurch, and that was sort of late 80s, early 90s. And I left after university and did not go back until several years after the major earthquake. And I mean, apart from the obvious decimation and transformation of the city caused by that natural disaster, the other thing that stood out for me the most was the presence of Ngāi Tahu in that city. And it took a natural disaster and a complete mind shift to create it. And the city was very, very different to me then. Having lived there for so long and then coming back and seeing a different face to it, a different side to it, it was
Transformational.
yeah, it was hair on the back of my neck standing up stuff. It was just fantastic. So I don't, well, you don't need to, I'm not a resisting force in all of this. And I suspect that a lot of other pakeha are of the same view. And it's a case now of providing the opportunities for that voice to come through and express itself in urban transformation. Anyway, another philosophical rant from me, sorry. But I really do get the point that we've got to allow these environments to speak to Māori and allow them to express Māori in their form, their layout, their landscaping, their plants, everything. It's and I think the country will be far better for it.
One thing I think that the design guides end up becoming a bit of a Trojan horse, but a Trojan horse for good, is that it actually forces people to be in relationship with each other where they might not normally have to entertain the idea. And what's become really interesting is that over the last 4 years of engaging in this space, that that those really clear kind of lines of power and influence get very quickly dismantled by projects that we've been involved with, where the co-design process forces people to share power about decision making. And actually, once relationship is built, the design guides, as far as governing the distribution of or the apportionment of power, the dismantling of power, become almost they're not needed after that. Once relationships are built, where people have a vested interest in each other's aspirations. And it's funny, it doesn't take long before people recognize that actually they dream for the same thing.
Thank you, Kit, and thank you, Rennie, for that discussion. I think it's very powerful philosophy we're talking about. And certainly Campbell listening, Kuituai reporting officer, we have choices to make as decision makers. One of the choices we have is some of the parties are seeking removal of the design guides totally. some of the parties are suggesting that there needs to be some more work done on them. And then, so on that basis, I was particularly interested in what Te Areawa, Whanui are doing. And I know the Wellington District Plan reviewers coming up, but they must be quite well advanced on that.
Yeah, they are. And it's because there's so many projects going on in Wellington.
Yes.
You know, because of the, there's great re-strengthening that, that they just realised that they can't keep up with it. And unfortunately, they're getting varying degrees of success. So
Yes.
one of the things that the design guide seeks to do is to kind of standardise at least the quality and level of engagement, and also, I suppose, helps iwi to recognise where they need to upskill, and yeah, I think the sector's rapidly changing to try and accommodate, because it's incredibly exciting to what you know, the results that have come out of co-designs have, and it's hard to kind of put words around it, but I think it, you know, secretly lights up parts, you know, little parts of everybody, not just Māori. So, you know, I think as the country kind of seeks to try and figure out, you know, strip away some of the dead wood and figure out who it wants to be, not only domestically, but also at the international stage, you know, Aotearoa kind of leads a really strong reconciliatory voice, you know, in the on the global landscape, you know, which is really, really cool. And I think this is a really you know, the design guide is actually a response to Aotearoa trying to figure out stripping away some of the bullshit in our history, and trying to figure out how can it you know, pave way for a just future.
And we were at the Te Hono yesterday with the airport manager. They've asked us to get an ISE sitting on the airport special purpose zone as well. We were doing a site visit. So and we had a visit there with Noel and Koye Amaru.
Oh yeah.
And we were taken through right from the southern end where the story begins, where the earth's right up against the building and the connection with Tuanuku, right through there. We spent about half an hour in January with them. And you're right, it does, you have to take time to actually understand the history. So it will actually really resonate. And the more we can do that in co-design, design guides going forward in these plans, the better, I think. So I'll perhaps, I'm interested in the Whanganui Tara example. I just have one little question really, and it's about this question of resourcing. You mentioned that everyone's struggling with resourcing, particularly around planning practice. But in essence, the position of the council was that when the design guides were being prepared, they didn't have time or resources to do the co-design stage. I think that's been rejected by Sarah and Maria's evidence that if there was a will, it probably would have been a way. So we have this choice of either accepting the design guides, perhaps suggesting that there probably is some work that can go on between parties between now and finalising our decisions about doing what we can within the scope of the submissions, and perhaps looking at the Tara example and see what might be able to be done in the time frame. So everyone's aware that we've been suggesting that with several of the topics. And Campbell this morning mentioned that we'll be open for, see what might be able to be worked on. We've asked Campbell to come back to us tomorrow and write a reply. I'll ask them some questions of Maria and Sarah about that. I think it seems to me that there is an opportunity for some further development of those design guides within the scope of the submissions, even though they haven't asked for specific words. That will be a question scope we would have to look at. Rangi, that's all from us, and thank you very much again. Murray, are you next off the?
Excuse me. So it's been a while since I've prepared evidence.
Yes.
But I think for me, and I'm going to take this. But for me, the reading the Section 42A report and preparing this evidence, the main, it made me really angry, to be honest, because council received feedback from Kaitiaki in May of 2016 that the design guide needed to be rewritten or to be drafted in conjunction with Tangata Whenua. That was prior to notification of the district plan, and then following notification, both Te Kotei Tango Te Aotearoa and Te Kauru Taranaki submitted that same advice again, that the design guides needed to be redrafted with the input of Tangata Whenua. And since those submissions until the Section 42A report, Te Kahui received no communications about how the relief sought in the submission might be worked through. And so, in terms of my reading and my response to the Section 42A report and recommendations, it was anger and frustration. And in my evidence, I said that that the recommendations, I don't believe there's enough there. Well, I don't believe that I could make specific wording changes that would change the content of the design guide to properly address the submission of Te Kahui in such a way that would be able to be helpful for this hearing, because as Rangi discussed, like it's that whole process of how we're going about creating these design guidelines that we need to be, Tangata Whenua needed to be involved back at the kaupapa designing phase, rather than let's look at what the content of the design guides are. And so I think that's the fundamental, in my opinion, that's a fundamental issue of these design guides. I think that there are other ways that the district plan does a really good job of hearing and acknowledging and incorporating Tangata Whenua values and outcomes and objectives and policies. But I think that these design guides are not one of those. And
You just kind of pause you there. Can you put your finger on a couple of bits and, well, a couple of aspects of the district plan which do what you just said? That incorporate values really, really well?
I think in the strategic objectives, there's a couple of the strategic objectives do really recognise that tangata whenua are cultural experts of their own rohe, and that tangata whenua have a right to be Māori in their rohe. And so those tangata whenua objectives, strategic objectives, I think will set a really clear direction for the plan in terms of acknowledging tangata whenua in their rightful place. Within the sites and areas of significance to Māori, there's some really good objectives and policies that go a long way to capturing the breadth and depth of meaning and value that is associated with some of those sites. I don't necessarily think they go the whole way, because I think it's difficult to do when you're dealing with, you know, planning and jargon and those kinds of things. But I think that it provides space to definitely explore those things in a way that's meaningful for tangata whenua. Yeah. In terms of the design guides, I think that are an opportunity for the Plymouth District Council to demonstrate themselves as being committed to being treaty partners with tangata whenua. That there's it's another avenue for council as an institutional representation of the Crown to provide for tangata whenua to be tangata whenua, and for that to be represented across the board within the district. Yeah, I think that Dangi has given some good examples of how good design guides or how co-design and design guides that are drafted or co-designed by tangata whenua and developers and councils can lead to really good outcomes for tangata whenua, but also for a district as a whole. And I think that, I think Te Hono is a fantastic example of when co-design is done well, you know, results can be transformational for tangata whenua, but also for our, not just the New Plymouth district, but Taranaki region as a whole. I thought I'd just touch on your question earlier, Commissioner Littlejohn, about that too, the preparing or drafting of design guides and then the implementation or how it might be, where it fits in terms of what domain, where it should be applied. And I'm similarly with Rangi, and I'm probably at the aggressive end of that, in which I think that it should apply across the board. Because from a Te Ao Māori perspective, tangata whenua or mana whenua are mana whenua within their rohe, regardless of ownership. And being mana whenua means that they have responsibilities for that whenua and for that whenua, and and that they are a kaitiaki of that place. And so, yeah, I think that having expression of cultural understanding or values or aspirations, priorities within that rohe, I don't think that's unreasonable. I don't think that I don't think that it has to be prescriptive or yeah, like a cookie cutter approach, but that there's that the way that the design guides could be prepared is that so there's a range of expression, and whether that's, like Tony said, through the types of plants that are encouraged, or how buildings interact with special places within that area, or how they link with the streets and other public spaces. I think that there are opportunities there that are consistent with the outcomes and aspirations that Māori have for Māori, but that also benefit things like character, amenity, and I guess like the public good associated with development. Yeah. And I guess linked with that is picking up on something you said earlier this morning around where this district plan relies on the overlays to do heavy lifting in terms of those sites or features that are acknowledged as having special value, or highlighted under section 6. And I guess for me, I acknowledge it and I accept that that's an appropriate way to deal with a lot of these features and things that require special attention. But I think that for Māori, as a Māori resource management practitioner, I feel that so often Māori are limited to that historic that historic understanding of what Māori were at 1840 or whenever it was that these archaeological sites or wāhi tapu were recorded. And while that's part of the Māori experience and the Māori lived reality, we're also here and now, and why should the expression of a Te Ao Māori view and a Te Ao Māori experience be limited to a point in time at 1835 or whenever it was? Like Māori were here then, but are here now, and they will be here in the future. So I don't think it's appropriate to limit the expression of Māori values and Māori understanding of the world to that one feature.
Yeah, I totally agree. A lot of the overlays are very protectionist focused, past focused, and so they should be, because those are things the Act in its higher order provisions says we've got to recognise and provide for. But of course, there's a section above section 6, which is section 5, and for as long as we've got it, it's our talisman, and it really, I mean, it echoes exactly what Rangi was saying about creating a future. And that doesn't, and yes, a part of that future, part of that character is in protecting and respecting and appropriately addressing the past. But it's also about creating an urban environment that respects the past, reflects it, speaks to it, and evolves it in a way. And that's where I think the design guides, even though they're buried at the back of the plan, that they are potentially a really critical part of it all. Because you look at the next 10, 15, 20 years for Taranaki, for New Plymouth, where is the most change going to happen? It's going to be in the urban environments. And yet the urban environments have a threshold where so much change can happen without any reflection of Te Ao Māori. And I mean, that's another thing I was going to talk to you about, because there comes a point where planning is about setting a threshold at which you create an opportunity for a conversation, but by setting that threshold, you're saying that everything below that, which is ironically, when it comes to urban change, residential change, what the government's telling us about encouraging more residential growth is effectively saying, okay, well, that is so important, we don't need to have a conversation about all of these other things that could potentially manifest through permitted development. And that's where a guideline, to some extent, is a potential, you know, it's potentially like a critical road book in a way, a little bit of, and why ought it, why should it only apply if you're doing 4 or more houses? When for the person who develops one section with 2 houses on it, maybe they could have laid out their 2 houses slightly differently. Maybe there was some old trees on the site that they could have got some advice on and thought, oh, we better do it differently. Hey, maybe I should only just plant these plants. You know, really simple things that they can do that actually have a meaningful, make a meaningful contribution when they are done at scale. So, yeah, I'm still wrestling with the importance of these documents, because otherwise, the way in which you know we've tried to reflect the strategic directions down through the plan in terms of the objective and policy framework. That's all fantastic. It's all a whole lot of words, but when they're not engaged on potentially the majority of change that's going to occur, just get the sense we've done something wrong. And that's where the guidelines potentially do provide that more flexible, iterative document that can evolve and be developed and actually come to represent that shared vision for how the urban environment is going to change. And yes, in some cases, they might not need to be rigorously applied, but if they're there, everyone knows them, and everyone who embraces the vision for Taranaki, for New Plymouth, looks at that document and says, okay, I'm going to build a couple of houses on this section. What's a really cool way to do it to reflect the vision? And yeah, I don't have to. There's no rule that says I do, but I want to. I want to play a part. And it's really hard to try and achieve those sorts of things within a statutory framework sometimes. And yeah.
And I think also it's an opportunity to, because we do, every so often, we do get developers who, or private landowners who are wanting to build and want feedback from Hapu around what would be appropriate in their landscape. And often Hapu are really happy to engage in that, but it's time consuming, and and there's no resource for that. And so this is one way potentially of giving out that advice
Exactly.
without burdening our Hapu and iwi members with these demands for that cultural input when there aren't necessarily specific cultural impacts that we're looking to avoid, mitigate or mitigate.
And that's a really sage point, because from a lot of Pakeha developers, and I see it all the time in Tamaki, they're actually scared. They are scared because they don't have a relationship. They have lived, they've got this notion from the media of a grievance mentality that is tangata whenua because of the process over the last 40 years. And they're scared to go and ask the question, hey, because they fear that it's just going to be a no, it's going to be a negative. And to some extent, I mean, Taranaki is very, I mean, it's different, very different from Tamaki in terms of the cohesion of tangata whenua, which I found is really, really refreshing. and the consistency of, I mean, all different, but you're all rowing the waka in the same direction to some extent. You've all each got a different paddle, but you're all going, and that's really impressive. And it's one of the things I take back and I tell my colleagues in Tamaki, oh, you've got to, this is just very different down here. A lot of them just shake their heads and go, no, it can't be like that. So I guess what you say there is great, because absent the guidelines, what the consistent approach through the plan, all the overlays, the heavy lifting chapters has been, is that let's let happen what we think is not really a problem, but for everything over that, we want some sort of process. We have to call it a resource consent process because that's the only tool the law gives us to create a conversation to some extent. And let's put policies in and objectives in and assessment criteria that require engagement with tangata whenua, require specialist knowledge of tangata whenua to be sought and incorporated and thought about in the process of an application. And I mean, in a way, that is just a really time-consuming co-design process, isn't it? And it happens on a site-by-site basis, and it is going to be very time-consuming. And it may not be that it's necessary because the issues might not be that great. And I think what you just said, that a design guide that's actually a co-designed vision for this urban change could provide a really efficient way for parties to start a relationship that might not exist at the moment. We've got this document. Let's read it. Oh, hey, Māori don't want to stop everything. They actually want to achieve some really good stuff as well. Oh, hey, actually, I've been really nervous. I've got a SASM up in the back paddock. I didn't want to go and talk to anyone about it, but now that I've read this document, I see that I shouldn't be afraid of that. And the best thing I could do is go and talk to someone. And so it actually becomes a shared space for those relationships and that consultation to occur.
Yeah, and I think it also, is an introduction point for people who are scared or have no idea about what tangata whenua might be thinking or wanting, and it gives them it's like a toddler pool. They can, jump into that for a bit and familiarize themselves before they, an example that I'm aware of is so South Taranaki District Council and Kawerau Taranaki have developed some development and design guidelines for the coastal area in the South Taranaki district. And so that was borne out by a resource consent process where Te Kāhui proposed development in the coastal protection area. And following that process where the resource consent was granted, these development and design guidelines were created with council and iwi, and now for all coastal or all dwellings, resource consents for dwellings within the coastal protection area for the Taranaki iwi rohe, those design guidelines are given to applicants before and they outline things like lighting, planting, yes, height of structures, orientation, that kind of things. Finishes, like so colours in terms of light reflectivity, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, and so those have planting and landscaping and those kinds of things. And so they've been developed and that has streamlined a lot of resource consent engagement with applicants, because we can provide them with these guidelines and say, you know, these are the guidelines that we've developed with SDDC. These are the things that we're comfortable with within the coastal protection area. Obviously, if there are sites of significance or other input from hapu regarding wahitapu or sensitive areas, then that gets included in the overall engagement, but it provides a clear direction to applicants and to landowners around, like, this is our expectation, this is why we're wanting to have native endemic plants. This is why we ask that lighting be hooded and you know, all of those kinds of things, so that it's not on, they can see what the outcomes that we're trying to get. And so I think it can, co-designing design guidelines can really lead to great outcomes.
All right, well, my next question then is, in your relief sought in your evidence in April, you recommended that the design guides be amended to include more explicit reference to tangata whenua and recognise and provide for section 6E. At the start, did I hear you correctly when you said that you don't think this is a simple wordsmithing exercise? Okay, so to some extent, having said that, do we read your relief then as these documents need to go back through another process to be fit for purpose from your perspective?
Yes.
Okay. Then my next question is then, what ought we to do in the interim? Is it better that there be no guidelines until a version 2.0 is prepared? Or is there enough in the current guidelines, accepting that they have not been put through a Mātauranga Māori lens? Are they better to be a non-statutory document in their current form and easily amendable? Or are they best as a statutory document in their current form and will have to go through a Schedule 1 process?
I suggest that we just hot tub those questions around the three planners while we've got the opportunity, because there are some key questions. And
I don't know. Okay. But I think for me, it's a possibility that some of the content of the design guidelines would not change if they were to be redrafted with tangata whenua. But I think that could only be determined after you step back and look at the kaupapa and what are the outcomes that are being sought. So it could be that if we step back and say, okay, this is our vision, this is our outcome, then some of what has already been written in those design guides might be relevant and might still be useful, but until that first piece has been worked through, you can't really determine whether or not parts would be retained or in their current form or amended or whatever. So it's one part. In terms of statutory versus non-statutory, I can see the value in having it as non-statutory in order to change it without going through a Schedule 1 process. However, I also think that there would be benefits to going through a Schedule 1 process, in that there would be a public consultation, that there's opportunity for Whenua and the community at large to also have input into that. And although I note that there hasn't been, the design guides haven't garnered a lot of submissions and evidence, but I think that they are really key parts of, I guess, resource management and planning, and they have the opportunity to really make a massive difference in what our towns and even rural areas look like. And so I think that, it doesn't really help, but I didn't really give you an answer, but yeah. I can
Any other
understand.
planners, Sarah? I know this is efficient for us to ask these key questions around the room, I think.
I think I go around in circles as well, I was up late, it was about 11:30. Danny and I were still talking about what his evidence was going to look like, because obviously we've had the benefit of the hearing being moved, so we had more and more one about it. So I guess for me, there are some really relevant points in the design guide. But, listening to Danny's kōrero today around it being us wanting us as a Māori controlling our own destiny, and being able to participate in the development of those design guides, that's one part of it. And I know that probably the first time that Danny presented and speaking around, that around Māori being reflected in development, it could be something really subtle as the landscaping, or to us isn't subtle, but to someone building a new whare, that planting is a subtle way of recognising our relationship with the whenua to something as overt as te homo, or the archives building that Danny's working on, or the library, or everything else that Danny's working on that I'm hurrying him up on as well. So I think the non-statutory versus statutory, I think. Obviously, tomorrow you're hearing from one submitter in particular who's, one of the worst culprits that we're working on that relationship. But I think to the likes of those bigger developers, or those providing community housing, that they would really benefit from those design guides. And it's the same for our commercial arms of the trust that we work for as well. But yeah, I think that engaging that expertise of creatives as well. So there's almost two aspects to Tangata Whenua as well, in that you've got the creatives like me, and then you've got that expert advice of hapu, of Whenua as well, and how they can inform those from their experiences and their realities into creating a better urban environment for our mokopuna, for their mokopuna, for my mokopuna, for your mokopuna. Round and round.
Any reflections, Campbell? Well, I think it's
Yeah, fascinating discussion. I would endorse and agree very much with the comments from Maria that the design guides represent, I think, a pretty unique opportunity to sort of form the basis of a change in built identity for the New Plymouth district. You know, our own brand and our own way. I think in a deeper way, yeah, another opportunity for effective co-governance, for you know, participation in resource management. And I agree that I think in a lot of places in my report, I've just talked about, you know, the general nature of wanting to achieve better design, but if the design guides appropriately reflect Te Ao Māori and Mātauranga Māori, the invites tension, that would achieve a better design outcome for Māori. So that I don't think that's a point that I've really made that strongly, and I probably perhaps could have in my report. It's not just about the general design outcome, it's actually more than that. And I would agree that if we can make them work well, then they become this constant sort of reference point that can actually lead to more efficient practices as they you know, are embedded over time, you know, reducing burden on iwi and hapu potentially, you know, from more sort of reactive sort of spaces, you know, having to comment on things. I think, yeah, I'm certainly open to trying to use whatever flexibility we've got now to make the best of the guides as they stand. I think that would then form the basis of statutory documents, which would be embedded into the plan, which yeah, form the basis of a wider conversation for how they could be truly co-designed going forward. That's just one example of one thought. But
just the interesting thing is UFD 19, one of the strategic policies. Urban environments are well-designed, livable, connected, accessible and safe spaces for the community to live, work, and play, which, and then there's a list of 7 items, and you could probably say that at least 6 of them are being carried to some extent by the design guidelines. But the one that's not is the one that is incorporate Mātauranga Māori in design, construction and development of the built environment. And that's what the design guidelines, at least on their face, don't appear to be doing that, do they? There may be some outcomes of them that are similar, but they're not overtly dealing with that. So I then asked the question, if we're going to have a plan that's vertically integrated, what are the other provisions of the plan that speak to achieving that objective? How are we going to ensure that our urban environments are well-designed, livable, connected, accessible and safe spaces which incorporate Mātauranga Māori in the design, construction, development of it? I mean, at the moment, in the absence of the design guidelines doing that, we are very much reliant on that threshold of resource consent and the engagement obligation. I don't want to put it like an obligation, but the engagement requirement to seek the advice of tangata whenua on matters. And that's, I mean, that probably works. It's not an ideal solution. I think what we're all sort of getting to is that there's probably a better way. And the issue is, what do we do in the meantime with what we've already got? And yeah, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I would suggest.
And that's probably, and through my evidence, I recommend obviously some of the objectives and policies as well. But again, you know, this time that we've had this break and we've been able to learn more of Māori and with Bunny as well around what is the most efficient way as well to engage that expertise. And one thing, and just to reflecting on my experience with Separating is that, you know, as you know, New Plymouth District Council and the consent officers have changed how they're processing it in response to the present environment, is that now hapu are being engaged more often and are being able to say yes to things earlier than, you know, battle their way through a resource consent and butt heads with someone to get a good outcome. So I know we're talking about this, yeah, this engagement plan and if it's those objectives are added or a clear co-design process for developments is set out in the design guide. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I've got a four.
Yeah, you
four
go on.
questions.
Yeah.
Marty, I'm looking at your appendix one, which is your section 32 AA analysis of changes. So you've sort of worked through 4 options. As I read it anyway, and correct me if I'm wrong, but on the left-hand side, you've got amend design guides to include a paragraph acknowledging the introductions. So, and then you have other reasonably practical options. Obtain the guide as notified. Read the guide as per the section 42A recommendations. Or rewrite the guides in partnership as requested in your submission. So there are 4 quite distinct avenues, which we all in a way have an ability to work on. My thinking is that definitely you could put an opening paragraph or some preface in here that would help. I'm looking at even the cover of the guides. I know it's my least favourite plant in the world, on the right-hand bottom corner of the city centre one, those tiny windmill farms that are a scourge of my own property in Napier. It's just the sort of the feel of what you could do. Yeah. So is your preference really to just provide an introductory paragraph?
No, my preferred option is
Number
that
3.
I landed on amending the design guides to include a paragraph to at least provides some measure of recognition of Tangata Whenua, because within the subdivision there's a footnote that includes the word. I think it is. And that's it. And I think that's just atrocious.
On page 16 of the city and town centre design guide, there's a reference under 1.5 in sense of place. The top of the page there on page 16. Enhancing the city or town centre's local sense of place. The second one is acknowledging where relevant sites association with Maori for the history of the site's development and use. So I read that and then I thought about the work that was done on the Sadudi and Whiti Hapu and the design ethic that was developed after this was prepared, after the plan was notified. There was some very strong design on that that made that building very cool and really sense of place was right, because it was beside the Huatoki and it was very near sites, those sorts of things, prominent corner. I'm just thinking aloud that, do we have time and energy within the submissions to perhaps do some more work on this, carefully thinking about scope? Because I'm listening to the discussion with Kit about shall I throw the baby out in the bath? Does it feel right to actually have something firm within the plan, because a lot of these urban design outcomes are pretty strong. They don't have that essence and flavour from Tangata Whenua, but they do resonate with good livable houses and those sorts of things. So Sarah, I asked Campbell to come back to us as what required, give us some direction about how we might think a bit of a go forward plan on bringing some elements into the design guidelines that might better reflect Yeah, Maori. So, hmm.
Just picking up on what tools we've got, how much time we've
Oh,
got.
that's right, Simon,
Um,
ocean study.
To some extent, Sarah's suggestions are in effect a potential interim sort of proposition, aren't they? You've attached to all controlled or restricted discretionary activities in the residential zone some very, very focused matters of assessment that would be engaged on resource consents. So to some extent, you'd have the design guides doing their job, and then you would have the application by application engagement that seeks to be able to address these matters of discretion on a case by case basis that would effectively lead to that relationship building on a case by case basis. Yeah. So there is that's a
Yes,
yeah, it's a potential. Well, and
what's another method?
Another method.
Alignment with
Yeah.
the design guidelines, which might be able to be tweaked, might be the word, or,
Yep.
or
it doesn't.
enhanced.
I mean, or what it doesn't do, and mind you, nor does the design guide do it, is it doesn't apply to activities below restricted discretion or control. So there would still be an amount of development occurring where there's no general line of sight to either engagement with tangata whenua or reference to the guidelines. So ultimately we'd have to be happy that that threshold was set at the right place.
And not to, when I think about it and the my mahi now, I'm never to, it's not about stopping the mums and dads and uncles and the koro and kui of the world from, building their one dwelling, their new dwelling. It's that, it is about that sense of place and that, just reflecting on, I use corridor, that controlling our destiny and how it reflects Māori, those larger developments.
So to that extent, you've obviously thought about this threshold when you drafted these provisions, so that they would enable anyone in the residential zones to effectively, let's say there was a vacant section, they could go and put a new house on it, and they could do what they like. Okay, subject to compliance with the building code and anything else they might want to take into account, they could do that. Mums, dads, careers, the likes, they could, if they've got an existing site that's big enough, they could put a second dwelling on, and they wouldn't have to engage with any of this. And then potentially, if they wanted to go and subdivide it later, they could also do that. So that you could get those very small scale infill happening with a limited degree of bureaucracy, but consequently a limited influence or engagement with tangata whenua. I mean, are you okay with that?
Well, I think that, and thinking back to my experience at Newfoundland Fishery Council, particularly with the rural design rights, which obviously aren't statutory documents, but encouraging, and what I did was to encourage people to use them, even if they didn't need them. So I would expect that if you were a good planner, that you would be encouraging people to still follow these guidelines.
You're at the front desk, someone comes in, no, you don't need a resource consent, but hey, look, if you're thinking about doing it, here's a great piece of work.
Some plants you might want to plant in your
Nurseries.
Yeah.
Hastings District have just released a document like that, which is sort of like a coffee table document that they have the front counter, and they've sent copies out. Like I've got 2 copies in the mail from them, because I'm one of the local practitioners about the design now. I think that was code design and planting and things. So there's opportunity to do that also on top of what might be able to be pulled together in these current documents.
And those guidelines at that time, I was at the council when they were developed. And at that time, I don't think Newfoundland was ready for those guidelines. The development community was ready for them. I think now we're at the time where we are, and referring back to the Kōrero, that they will evolve. And you know, I've been on about this for almost a year now, that, you know, as Māori, we're never static either. I probably don't think anyone ever is.
Well, no, humans have been manipulating their environment for hundreds of thousands of years. That's what we do.
Yeah.
So it's the one thing we all have in common, really. We all quite enjoy it. Like Bunnings is so successful. One last question then. At the moment, we've got the reporting officer and council saying, as far as a permitted number of dwellings in any of the residential zones go, 2 is it. You go 3 and over, you need a resource consent. We've got Kanga Ora saying, in the medium intensity zone, we think you should allow 3 as permitted. So you'd only need a resource consent for 4 and above. I mean, thinking about these numbers as being thresholds for engagement, do you have a particular opinion on that proposition from a cultural perspective and a planning perspective, obviously?
Critical of my colleagues at Kaimota.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can shoot the messenger, but I mean, the message is from their perspective that if we're actually going to make provision for our urban environment to do what it ought to be doing with minimal bureaucracy and cost to people, then we've got to set that bar a little bit higher and allow a little bit more with a little bit less bureaucracy to actually get threshold, because 100% of what they're allowing for is never going to happen. I mean, in fact, the experience in other big cities is that they're probably getting 30 to 40% of what's actually allowed for because of all of the vagaries of land development, the fact that not everyone wants to develop.
I don't have a particular view about it, but obviously I've evidence on the public comment provision. Not being a limit for public comment. I'm not sure that is this in a way of my particular view. I mean, I think that I understand the need for housing and prioritizing housing. You know, we talk about it. We're talking about it in the office all the time. Around vulnerability housing and yeah, but in terms of it engaging kind of similar in that process.
Yeah, I don't really have a strong position, but I think that there are always going to be costs associated with, you know, wherever you set that threshold. And I think that wherever that threshold is set, you need to be cognizant of the fact that in the past, tongues of whenua have often borne that cost, and that has resulted in the fact that Māori do not see themselves represented in the built environment. And so, while it might be useful in terms of getting more houses, are those houses representative of Te Ao Māori? Do they incorporate any kind of cultural expression? Are they sensitive to the environment? To me. So, yeah, I don't know if that number should be 2 or 3, and in some cases it might be 3, in others it might be 2, and others, you know. So, but I think my concern would be that are we continuing to perpetuate a system where Māori are again excluded from expression, or are we providing opportunity?
So it's about Tino Rangatiratanga, like that's the option if we do engage in it or not. So you're given that option, we can make that decision, and Māori would make that decision. To, is, do we need to be, to stringently review a two-house development? That accords with the design guide, and accords with our environmental management plan? That can be for the hapu to make that decision, but I would be making a planning recommendation around where you prioritize your time.
Well, as it's currently crafted, neither of those documents would be referred to in the context of a two-house development. So the question is there a risk that if you extended that to 3, then all of a sudden you're excluding recognition or application of those documents, or indeed the restricted discretionary criteria that you've proposed? Is there a risk that the creation, you have to read is there a risk that ends up perpetuating an absence of Māori in the built environment? And that's something I guess we're going to have to think about. Yeah.
So, Maria, you're done?
Thank you.
Sarah, is there anything you'd like to highlight? I suppose of the evidence and
A couple of things.
your paragraph 19 is that's what we've just been talking about.
Yeah,
But
yeah, and
then-
that's fine.
Yeah, but then you lead off with your key points, Sarah.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I guess just listening to the corridor this afternoon, I'm probably on the more aggressive end as well. Over the past year, that's probably what you're banging on about. But for me, I guess my experience comes out of, growing up. I had a really privileged life. I had a sheltered life. Spent some time in Plymouth District Council, spent some time in the UK, and now I'm blessed and privileged enough to be working with people with income, and just that I can use that my privilege to get across, I guess, what lots of these hapu practitioners have been trying to get across for 40 years. They've paved this pathway for on behalf of Maria, but as Potai, I was really lucky to be exposed to all of this marketing. So here, I'm trying to do good by those hapu that I'm working with. Sorry, I know this isn't independent, but just to give you a little bit of context. And then to be asked, well, why do you hate me? Well, I don't hate you. Well, why do you hate me? Why are you still trying to discriminate against Māori? We want to get a particular type of farm. It's hard. It's a hard space to be in. Anyway, so I'm on the aggressive end. And there's the ups and downs in that. Really great to hear that you spent some time in Waitara. So I was a bit rushed. That's why I wasn't here. I wasn't able to listen this morning. So I've been out on site on the Johnson Street property. So it was a private plan change that Commissioner Dash was the chair for that. And so we're now at a point in time where we're looking at subdivision for that. So again, Waitara is going to change again. We're really fortunate and really privileged that we get to participate in that. Sorry, that I get to participate in that process, and the hapu get to inform what it's going to look like for them and for their mokopuna and their mokopuna as Waitara continues to evolve as well. And so just thinking about that. I guess inviting evidence, the wānanga and the kōrero that I've had with him around achieving that design excellence and mana whenua or tangata whenua being part of it as well. So that was just that was the reality, that was the lived experience for us this morning in the sideways rain and the gale force winds, but we were out there doing it. So anyway, Just,
Were you out there with the hapu with Julie?
yeah. So that was, we were out there with
Mr. Harry?
Manikuriki, yeah. Otoro weren't able to make it today, but we will need to get out there.
So much progress is going on, you're okay?
Yeah. So there's, in that particular instance, so there's, obviously there was the provision around co-designing the reserve. So for me, it's really exciting because actually the reserve is the focal point, the reserve is the center of that development. So actually, once you design out of that reserve, we actually get to have a little bit more influence over the whole,
Yes.
over the whole, what the whole development looks like, rather than just what the reserve looks like. Because the reserve will contain the stormwater, infrastructure and the like. So, yeah, it was very exciting. Anyway, just a couple of things for me. So obviously, just to touch on my evidence, I made a comment around rezoning request at number 46 Junction Street. So that was actually covered off in the rural production zone. So that will be covered off in the hearing 22. So number 46 Junction Street is a deferred selection property for Taitanga. And we've requested that to be rezoned to residential. So I've actually covered that off in my evidence for the first piece of evidence for hearing. Just to reiterate, I guess that importance of engaging that expertise to inform urban development, and that we can't rely on those overlay chapters. You know, they're doing a lot of heavy lifting. And one of those examples was the Somerset settlement and there's a few two there. And the third thing was the public of provisions. So I guess just reflecting on the size of those Māori land, or the Māori land that we have in Plymouth, and I gave a couple of examples there as well around, you know, if you can only have two, dwellings on a 20 hectare lot, and then you have to apply for resource consent. I guess just thinking back to the strategic direction and that opportunity to empower Māori to live the way that we want to live. So did a little bit of research. So Te Puni Kōkiri, so they identify small scale public whāngai as being around 3 to 10 houses. And I've had some discussion with whānau as well, so down in South Taranaki, so Whakapapa down to Ngaruhine in the south. So we're looking at what our public whāngai strategy looks like for our hapu down there. Much bigger than two dwellings.
On the Papakāinga area.
So
Ruahine, is that south of Whanganui or
no, so we're South Taranaki.
South
Yeah,
Taranaki?
so we sort of wrap around the
Ruanui's not. Is
so
that-
Ngāti Ruanui, how's it different? Ngāti Ruanui.
Yes, yes.
And Uri o
So
Ngāti
between
Ruanui.
Ngāti Ranui and Taranaki.
Yeah,
Valley,
sorry,
and
yes,
it's getting
yes,
down.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so from Ohaue to Ihama.
Ish, a bit further.
Oh, that's good.
I guess just to give you a little bit of context to that as well. So, Te Korowai o Ngaruhine, so the post-settlement government entity for Ngaruhine are working on a Toi Te Whenua strategy. So where each our 6 hapu in Ngaruhine will have the opportunity to purchase the deferred selection properties back from Te Korowai. So in my hapu rohe, we have a school site. So we will likely be purchasing the school from Te Korowai. And yeah, the ideas from our whānau are amazing, you know, just what we can do with that whenua to get our hapu and our whānau back up on our feet. Not to say that we're not on our feet now, but you know, in a way that we can fix our own. Which you've heard from Ngā Hapu o Te Atiawa as well. You know, Tawhiri Kura talking about their vision for their development. I guess, and just reflecting on that type of whāngai around, you know, so the Tangata Whenua submitters have presented a lot of the evidence around the complexities of Māori land, and there can be many owners on whenua, so making it easier for Māori to be able to live and work our whenua in a way that we're not encumbered by all the time to do that. And then the fourth thing was obviously the design guides, which we've had been really good. Cordial this afternoon around that. And just to reiterate, very late wānanga with Rangi last night, and every week, Rangi, every day, every hour of the day, which I love. For forever challenging your perspectives and your thought processes, and which is really great, and as a Māori planner as well. And even, a conversation that I did have with Rangi around, well, is it best that we do if there's anything referenced in the design guides, or should it be driven by those objectives and policies, which is kind of where I landed. But that, and in Rangi's statement of evidence, that context of code, that context of relationship, and that context of design as well is really important. So to ensure that those design guides, that they don't replace that kanohi engagement, or any engagement at all with them. I guess I kind of see them as a way of describing our taiwhenua taitanga whai, so the Te Atiawa management plan as being that tool and that mechanism for engagement, and and working through those processes. Later.
Do you have any questions?
Yeah, just mostly, I mean, sort of exhausted myself talking about the design guidelines and the other things. Just around Papakainga and your evidence, start sort of at the end where you say, paragraph 42, your preference is not to constrain Papakainga by reference to residential unit numbers per se, but to rely on site coverage effect standards. And then you say, particularly given the current definition of Papakainga is tied to the definition of Māori land. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we heard in a hearing, I think it was the definitions hearing, about a proposal to get rid of this concept of Māori settlement land and just talk about Māori land. But not only would it be Māori land, that is land that has been acquired back through settlement, through a deed of settlement, but also in the future land that may simply be acquired by Māori. Your proposal here, would you say that it's appropriate to extend in that way? So, for example, if land was acquired by Te Atiawa, we're still going to work out if we do it, and then B, how you would define it, and it happened to be zoned residential, that by definition, provided there was compliance with the site coverage limits, you could establish Papakainga there for any number of units on the block?
Yeah, and I think just at my paragraph 43, where I've given a couple of those examples, and please keep in mind, I didn't discuss with the owners, I've purely given these examples of that complex nature of Māori land. Like, you've got 106 Pōhutukawa Drive, which is actually owned by Paranini Ki Waitotara Corporation. So, you've got 20 hectares there, and it's zoned residential, general residential, and you can only have 2 dwellings.
Unless you did a comprehensive subdivision, presumably, or...
You couldn't subdivide it. Would it be all partition?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So that, I guess.
What would the site coverage provide for? What's the site coverage in that zone?
That would be 40% or 50% general residential.
40, so it would be a 4 hectare coverage. That's just building coverage?
Yes.
Okay. So I see what you mean. So you're saying that you should be entitled, you should for Papakainga, not have a limit on how many individual units could be created, but effectively, as long as you could comply with the coverage requirements, you could make provision for any number of small dwellings.
And I will be honest, I haven't looked at, it does, if we construct, say if we use the
Yep.
PKW site, for example, which is probably a very bad example because it's on Tapuito, so it's on a site in the area of significance to Māori. So it would trigger resource compute, but if a road was constructed, does that road construction trigger that? I'm not across the intricacies of that, but would, or perhaps under the transport chapter would trigger the vehicle movements. We're going back a very long time now, and I'm not across all of that detail now. So
The other issue that always comes up, well, in my experience with Papakainga is that, I mean, we plans generally try and control the number of units because they think that the number of units of household families living on a property in and of itself has effects on site in terms of vehicles coming and going, maybe a little bit noisier, all that sort of stuff. So while things like bulk and location control amenity arising from physical structures, the control around the number of units is dealing with a slightly different form of effect from activity. The suggestion with Papakainga effectively would say that we are not concerned with that effect. Or is it saying that because of Section 6E, that is more important in the scheme of things than maintaining potential local residential amenity by the number of different households that might be on the land? We've got to, I mean, I just got to say, we've got to find a reason for a distinction. And what do you say it is?
it would pose a different scenario.
Yeah.
So say this wasn't Māori land and would able to be subdivided and it met the controlled activity status. The A, B, and C at paragraph 43 all have indicative roads on them. So if they met the controlled minimum lot size,
It wouldn't be that.
would there be any affected parties?
Yeah.
And you could potentially get, I don't know how many in it. So say the Wills Road one, for example, 2.3 hectares, and it's got the roads two roads converge on that property. Would there be any affected party?
Yeah.
What's the difference between there being 20 houses constructed after subdivision, vacant lot subdivision, and 20 Papakainga with the communal wharenui and the communal kota?
Yeah, okay, I hadn't tweaked that. So the Papakainga rules are there for almost a very specific situation where there is some limit on the ability to subdivide and create separate pakeha title, which you can then secure against and you can then transfer and sell. And so in the scenario, for example, where Tangata Whenua might acquire some general freehold land, would it naturally develop by way of Papakainga when the option of essentially subdividing and creating freehold titles and selling them and creating tenure was available to it because there wasn't the same constraints? Yeah, as you say, what's the difference? In fact, the Papakainga rule just gets around that issue of title, doesn't it?
And we've had that.
Yeah.
So we as in people have had that situation at Liquid Street and undertook a subdivision 2020, I think. Yeah, I think it was around 10. And it was I think medium density. Medium density, non-notified. So what would have been, yeah. The difference if we created a road there.
Well, that's really helpful. Thanks,
I mean, I'm not aware. I'm not aware of any Papakainga applications. We're talking with whānau at the moment around making applications for to construct public climate, but I'm not sure of any under the alternative. I mean, the other option is that we rezone a whole heap of Whenua multi-purpose zone so that we're.
Didn't bring my colouring pencil.
So that we
We'll get into that next week. We'll get into that next week. Okay, one other thing I just want to talk to you about. In paragraph 38 onwards, this is where you've set out your recommended insertions into the residential zones so that the specific objectives and policies actually do some of the lifting, if I can put it like that. And I understand just some of your language I'm interested in. So you're suggesting, and they're pretty much the same throughout the three, one new objective and 3 new policies. The objective I don't have any questions about. The policies though, we've got the starting phrase, and it's fairly standard planning language. Recognise is the first one. The second one is ensure that, and the third one is control the design. So is it your evidence then that it is the specific matters of discretion that are aimed at achieving those particular policy directives? Recognise, ensure, and control. All, great, it's pretty standard policy language, but in terms of where they actually getting, how they get engaged, what's the machinery below this that does the recognising, does the ensuring, and does the controlling?
Yeah, I guess it's matters of discretion. And again, this wording, it's wording that I used in my evidence hearing 18 as well. And so it's the wording that's come out of plan change 49 as well. But yeah, just back to your first question, I guess, yeah, using those matters of discretion because they are restricted discretionary activities.
Yeah, the matters for discretion, avoidance or mitigation of adverse effects on historic heritage, and the ability of Tāngata Whenua to exercise their relationship with their cultural traditions, ancestral land, water bodies, sites, areas, and landscape. So does the proposal avoid or mitigate adverse effects, and what ability does it provide for the exercise of the relationship? So these putting the planning practitioner's hat on, who's got a resource consent application that's restricted discretionary. They're looking at these matters, so they're looking at those things. The degree to which development recognises and provides for cultural values, the protection of historic heritage, and the ongoing relationship of Tāngata Whenua with the area. But those are all fine as far as they go. But in terms of your PNEW 3, for example, control the design of buildings and structures within the zone by ensuring cultural narratives are reinscribed in the environment through applied cultural expression, including language, technology, design, and public art, incorporating rainwater collection systems, maximising passive solar design opportunities, and avoiding a dominance of built form over space. Which again, I think are fantastic policies. Where do you see those being achieved in your matters of discretion, or are you relying on the fact that the person who's reading these, the developer, to be able to answer those matters has got to go and speak with Tāngata Whenua, and in the course of that conversation, the policy is going to come up for discussion, and then that developer is going to take on board those things and put forward their proposal in a way that achieves the policy. Is that the expectation?
Yeah.
Okay, so you wouldn't add to the matters of discretion to be more specific about, even go right back to the strategic objective here, the one that we referred to, incorporating Mātauranga Māori in the design, construction, and development of the built environment.
Yeah, so I think I probably as well have tried to take on some of the cordial that we've had with you, so that we've had with you through the other hearings,
Yeah.
and not trying to replicate what the strategic direction,
Yeah.
all of those objectives say, and that they're all read as a whole. So I think that's what I was,
Yeah,
when I looked at them,
and
that's what I was trying to get at, but looking at that PU3, potentially some of those could come down into the matters.
because with a restricted discretionary activity, of course, you've still got to have regard to the objectives and policies, even the ones right up the top. But at the end of the day, the council, for example, could not refuse consent on the basis of those matters if the proposal simply failed to express a cultural narrative. See what I mean?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, because the objectives and policies, while they are guidance and need to be read, that they're not on the table when it comes to approving or declining them.
Yeah, and I think there's probably, if that was a way that the panel were going to go, and there was going to be the new policies that perhaps they could be refined, so that they were more, it was more to encourage that that engagement of Tangwhenua as well, and through some of the conferencing that I've participated in, is that some of the other matters of discretion are recommended in other chapters that the practitioners have agreed that, yeah, that way that matter of discretion is worded, that it would trigger that requirement. In their opinion, in our collective opinion, what we've agreed in the joint witness statement, that it would trigger that requirement for engagement. So, yeah, if that's what you wanted, I would be happy to look at.
Well, I'm just sort of trying to untie this knot we've sort of put ourselves in. Can I ask a question, Cam? At what point does residential development in the residential zones, regardless of unit number, trigger from restricted discretionary to fully discretionary? Is there a point, or is it always restricted discretionary regardless of how many?
It is capped at restricted discretionary, so that's in relation to both the general res and medium density. Low residential is set up as a full discretionary.
That's right. So in the low residential, the objectives and policies would be on the table in any decision making, but in the general and the medium, which are by far and large the most extensive, they have to be had regard to, but they're not brought to bear effectively on the restricted matters. So that's okay. That's something to bear in mind. Okay, no, thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I
Sarah.
might just evolve that discussion a little bit more. Sorry, I'm looking at your page 10 and the policy P. Are those matters A to D really covered under the first matter of discretion? Avoidance or mitigation of adverse effects on strike heritage and the ability of Tangata Whenua to exercise a relationship. So if you've got a matter of discretion like that, you would be thinking about dealing with your matters and your policy A to D to give effect to that matter. Yes?
Yeah.
Particularly the words and the ability of Tangata Whenua to exercise a relationship, etc. So that's a doing part of the matter of discretion, and to achieve that, you'd have to go and look, you'd be thinking back towards policy PU3 A to D. That's your view?
And for some more context, I think in the drafting of that particular policy for in Plan 49.
Yes, but that's,
And so I was thinking it from that advice that had come through in the cultural impact assessment. So I would have taken that to, then. I know they're good for everybody.
Examination, sir.
the reason I'm thinking about this is that we've lived this in a policy sense in Plan Change 49. The Harrods, at Waitara, they had quite a good proposal, but there hadn't been any discussion. But through the hearing, we evolved this work in practice, I think. I think Sarah's feeling is trying to bring that, and it seems to be working pretty well on the ground. Sarah's trying to bring that through into the plan generally through the words that we crafted in that and change 49 decision. So,
So that's how I've tried to link those,
yes,
well, in Plan Change 49, how those particular outcomes were linked to that matter of discretion. That they were a whenua outcome.
These are policies that already, these are words that already exist somewhere in a plan somewhere.
I'm going to hear them in hearing.
Okay, right. Because you could, I mean, I take your point, you know, you could potentially take the second part of the first assessment criteria and make it a D in the second one. So the degree to which the development recognises and provides for the ability of Tangata Whenua to exercise or express their relationship with their culture. So you have that as a very focused matter there. And so then that then would effectively speak right back to all of those three new policies. I don't know, maybe just food for thought. We could spend hours redrafting everything, couldn't we? But we're not going to.
Not our job.
That's not our job.
No, well, ultimately, our job to see this process, but
Yeah,
this sort of discussion,
that's
well,
very
I think
helpful.
really does have obviously some influence to what you might do. But see, Sarah, your final, well, back to the design guides, you're suggesting that you would like to see some further discussion, paragraph 53 on the design guides. There was some discussions on those through some further conferencing or process. You also look at, I suggest you also look at your suggested objectives, policies, in the zones themselves. And see whether there might be some content or requirement with Campbell and others.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really helpful anyway with I'm hearing 18 at the moment.
Yes, that's the structure plan design areas. What I found quite useful there is we've suggested to Hamish, no, it was Laura, that she sets the scene for how that might be done, timeframes, who's involved, what's done, came back to us rather than us setting everything. And if we are thinking about process, that plan was set up by Laura, within, you can only achieve so much in the timeframes. And the NG and that's all I had as well. I'm looking at the clock. It's 3:20. It's been an interesting afternoon. Any other questions that we feel with Ash?
I think,
Right, no further questions.
Were you listening?
Hmm.
No fucking coffee? Okay, well, anyway,
just left this thing on, has he?
Probably
You're probably
careful.
rushing around. Anyway, tēnā tātou, nē rā te mihi kia koutou katoa. Yeah, ki pātia hea he ki pātia no reira he kareke mai kapi, unuhia I te uwhaka nui. Wātea kia māma te nākau te tina nā ki wairua I te arawhakatu. Koia rā e rongo whakiiri a ki runga, kia wātea, ai rā, ko wātea, au, pai mārere.
Nice to see you, Gina. You've been listening in.
Oh,
he was there.
Just putting a shirt on.